Okay, in today's lesson we're going to talk about how the World Wide Web works, alright, and what we're looking to do is we're looking to be able to explain the difference between the World Wide Web and the Internet, and we're looking to be able to explain what happens when you request a web page. Okay, now before we start, we're just going to do a little bit of a recall to retain, so I'll ask you this question, what does this picture show? Okay, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video for a minute and just see if you can remember what this picture shows. Okay, so hopefully you've paused and haven't just continued. Alright, but obviously what this picture shows are those undersea cables, those submarine cables that connect all of those networks together that form the internet. Okay, so you can see all of those submarine cables that span the globe to make up the internet. Okay, and without those cables the internet just wouldn't work. Alright, so we're going to move on. So I've got another recall to retain question. Alright, so again I'm going to want you to pause the video for a minute and just have a go at answering the question on your own, and then come back and see if you get the answer correct. Okay, so this question is, can you define the internet? Alright, so pause now. Okay, so hopefully you've paused for a minute, and let's see if we remember what the definition of the internet is. Okay, so the internet is a wide area network that spans the globe. Okay, now we can be a bit more specific about that, and we can say that the internet is a network of networks. Okay, that spans the globe. And if you can't remember what we learned about the internet, alright, make sure you check the last video in this series where we talked about the internet and what it was and how it worked. Okay, so we're going to move on. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the World Wide Web. Alright, so again I want you to take a minute and I want you to see if you can find out for yourself what we mean by client server. Okay, so because the World Wide Web is an example of client server architecture, so I want you to take a minute and see if you can find out what we mean by client server architecture. Okay, so hopefully you've taken a minute, and basically client server describes a relationship. Okay, so here we've got our client, that's you or me, alright, and then here we've got a server. Alright, and basically it's just like you would find at a food truck. Okay, and so if you think about it, in a food truck we have something that's very similar to a client-server relationship. Okay, we've got you, and what you're going to do is you're going to request a service, which in this case is to get some food. Okay, so you're going to request a service. Alright, that's going to go to the food truck. Alright, the food truck is going to prepare your food, alright, and then they're going to provide you with the result. Okay, so the food truck is doing us a service, alright, and the food truck in this situation is our server, which is doing something for us. Alright, so it's providing us with a service and then it's returning the result to us. Okay, and we are the client, so we are the customer who is requesting the service. Alright, and that's what we mean by a client-server architecture. Okay, so if you think about it in terms of the World Wide Web, can you think, and again I'm going to want you to pause the video for a minute, can you think what service the server is doing for us in terms of the World Wide Web? Alright, so pause the video for a minute and then come back. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video for a minute. Hopefully you came up with some good ideas. Alright, if we think about this in the World Wide Web, what service does the server provide? Well, it's storing information for us. Okay, the World Wide Web is basically a huge store of information. It's a library of information, and so in this case, in this situation, the World Wide Web, the server is storing that information for us. Okay, so it's storing web pages. So the server is storing web pages. Now, in terms of the World Wide Web, those web pages are not just stored on one server. Okay, those web pages are stored on different servers that are connected together using the internet. Okay, so the internet is the medium that we're using to connect all of these servers together, and the servers are then storing all these web pages for us that we can then request to download. Alright, so in terms of the World Wide Web, the server is just storing data for us, storing information. Okay, So if we think about this now, then, so the next part of the lesson is to think about, well, how do we request a web page? How do we obtain a web page? Okay, and so the story starts, doesn't it, with a browser, and you might use any of these. Okay, we've got Edge here, we've got Safari. This one's Opera. I don't know if anyone's met this one. Okay, Firefox. We've got Chrome. There may be others, alright, but this is where our story starts. Our story starts with a browser, okay? And a browser's job is to interpret, okay? So the browser interprets. Now, what does it interpret? Well, again, we're doing this in another lesson, aren't we? But a browser's job is to interpret HTML. Okay, so it's to interpret HTML code, which is used to create web pages, and it's and then the browser interprets that code and displays the page that code generates. Okay, so the browser's job is to interpret the HTML. It also has to go and retrieve that HTML. Okay, which is what we're talking about now. All right, so what happens when it retrieves that HTML? All right, so we're going to move on. So the way that you do it is you type an address into the address bar. So this is the address bar at the top of the screen. Okay, this is what you would normally see at the top of your screen. You type in an address. In this situation, I've typed in www.google.co.uk. Okay, and that's the first thing you do. You type in an address into that address bar at the top. Okay, and look, we need to be more specific. This is actually called, all right, this address is actually called a URL. Okay, and that stands for Uniform Resource Locator. So you type into the address bar a URL, a Uniform Resource Locator. Okay, now what we're going to look at now, and this time I'm going to give you 2 minutes, so I want you to pause the video for 2 minutes this time, and I want you to go and find out if you can find out what the different parts of this URL represent. So we've got a URL here, so I want you to pause the video for 2 minutes and see if you can work out what the different parts represent. Okay, so did you have any luck? Alright, we're going to go through and you can see if your answer, what you found out, matches what I'm going to tell you. Alright, so if we have a look, the first part then, okay, is the protocol. So this tells us the protocol that we're going to use. Now a protocol is just a set of rules. Alright, so it tells the computer how we're going to communicate with the another computer. Alright, and in this case we're using the HTTP protocol. Alright, and you're probably very familiar with HTTP. You probably see that a lot when you request web pages. Alright, the other one that you may also see is HTTPS. Alright, and you can maybe take a little bit of time after the video and work out what the difference is between HTTP and HTTPS is. Okay. Alright, the next bit just tells us that the server that we're looking for is on the World Wide Web. Alright, so we're not too worried about that. That bit just tells us that the server that we're looking for is on the World Wide Web. Okay, now this bit is really, really important. This second part, okay, is what's known as a domain name. Okay, and this is the name of the server. So this is the server that that's going to host our web pages. Alright, remember we talked about at the start of the video, we said there were lots and lots of servers that make up the World Wide Web that store these pages, okay, these pages of information. So this domain name, the bbc.co.uk, sorry, this domain name, this tells us, this is the address of the server that contains the information that we specifically are looking for. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about domain names later on in the video. Okay, so this is the final part of our Uniform Resource Locator, and if you think about this, if this is the computer, alright, which is what we just talked about, we just said that this part here was the computer that we're looking for, so actually this bit just tells us where on the computer. Alright, and in fact we can be even more specific when we talk about where on a computer, because we can say that this actually represents a folder, and I'm sure you recognize that this is a file name. Okay, so that's the final part of our URL. So URLs are a really important part of our story about how the World Wide Web works. Okay. Okay, now again I want you to think about this for a minute, so I'm going to ask you to pause the video again for a minute. So here we've got a problem. If you think about this, we said that this here, bbc.co.uk, represented the address of the computer that we were looking for. Okay, now that gives us a problem, and again I want you to pause for a minute and I just want you to think, can you think about what that problem might be? Okay, yeah, did you get any ideas? Okay, it is concerning what we talked about in the last lesson, okay, and what we talked about in the last lesson, sorry, I'm just going to go back that slide. What we talked about in the last lesson is that the computer itself does not recognize this. Okay, so this domain name for us is easy to read, okay, and for us it's easy to remember. Alright, so it's much easier for me to remember and read bbc.co.uk, okay, but a computer can't read that. Alright, and so a computer, actually, this needs to be turned into, remember, maybe you remember what we talked about in our last video. In our last video we talked about that everything on the internet has a unique identifier, something that uniquely identifies it, and we called that an IP address. Okay, so what we are going to need to do is we are going to need to turn this, which is great for us, it's easy to read, easy to remember, into the IP address, which is what the computer needs to be able to find this computer here. Okay, and the only way the computer can do that is with the IP address, the unique code that identifies that particular computer on the internet. Okay, so we're going to talk now about how that happens. Okay, so we're going to look at this next slide. So the way that our computer finds out the IP address of using it from a domain name is they use what's called the domain name system. Alright, they use a domain name server, and you can go and do this on your own computer, and okay, so you can go and do this at home if you want, but what happens is basically our computer goes off to the domain name system and says, okay, well, I've got this domain name, please can you tell me the address. Alright, and that's what we get here. Okay, so we've got a system that we can send a domain name to, and then it gives us back the IP address that our computer can then use to go and access the data on that computer. Okay, but we can't access the data on the computer until we've got this address, until we know what the IP address is. Okay, but if you look at this, so why do we need all this system again? If you look at this, the IP address is, imagine trying to remember that. Okay, you're not going to remember a whole load of numbers, so it's much easier for us to remember this than it is to remember this. So the reason why we use this program is just to make the internet a lot easier to use, the World Wide Web a lot easier to use. Okay, because you just have to remember the domain name rather than having to remember the IP address. Okay. So now I'm just going to break that down for us just to show what happens. Okay, so the first thing your computer does when you type in that address into the address bar, okay, is it goes and makes that request to the DNS server. All right, so in this situation I'm trying to access the bbc.co.uk. Okay, so it's going to request the IP address. All right, so the DNS server is going to return the IP address for that particular domain name. Okay, there is a little process. If say that DNS server doesn't know the IP address for that particular domain name, there is something more that happens there which you can go and investigate. Okay, but that's outside the scope of this video. Alright, so once our computer has got the IP address, alright, it can then send what's called a GET request. Okay, so it can then send a GET request, and again, this is all from the browser, so our browser is then going to get the web page. Okay, it's got the IP address, it's got that from the DNS server, so it knows where to send that GET request. Okay, so it sends a GET request to the server to get that particular web page. Okay, now assuming there's no reason why it can't, alright, our server will then send back that web page, okay, which the browser on our client, on our computer, will then interpret. Okay, and so we download index.html, okay, we receive that, the client receives index.html, and then our browser will start to interpret the HTML code that makes up that web page. Okay, and as it does that, what it's going to start to do is it's going to start issuing more GET requests. Okay, so for example, and again we're going to talk more about this in a later video, so for example, one of the things that our index.html might contain is a link to a style sheet. Okay, so basically what our browser is going to have to do is it's going to have to send another GET request to get that style sheet. Alright, so it's interpreting the code that came in index.html, and it finds that it uses a style sheet, so it's going to have to go and retrieve that style sheet. So it sends another GET request to the server to say, can I have this? Okay, and again, assuming there's no problems, alright, the server will come back and say, here is the style sheet that you wanted. Okay, and so the browser carries on interpreting the web page, and maybe it finds that we need a logo. Okay, so there's an image in the web page. So it's interpreting the HTML. It finds that there's an image that is required. If we want to show the web page correctly, we need an image. Alright, so again, it sends that GET request to the server. Okay, I need this image. This is the image I want. I want logo.jpg. Okay, and again, if there's no problems, then what we see is that the server returns the image. Okay, so basically that's the story of how we retrieve a web page, and how a web page is retrieved using the internet and the World Wide Web. Okay, hopefully it makes some sense. Now what I want you to do is I want you to go and just investigate for yourself and see for yourself that process. Okay, so you do that by depending on the browser that you use, you need to go to View and go to Developer Tools. Okay, and if you go to Developer Tools, you should see something looking a bit like this. Alright, and if you click on Network, alright, and then refresh the page, you will see everything that your browser is doing to retrieve the contents of your web page. Okay, and hopefully it should match the story that I've just told you. Alright, thanks for watching.